So Charles Spencer has quietly detonated a bombshell that rewrites 3 entire decades of royal family history. And honestly, the way he chose to do it is almost more fascinating than what the letter actually says. Picture this. The man slipped on a pair of white cotton archivist gloves, lifted an antique mahogany box out of a vault buried beneath his mansion, and turned an ornate iron key in the lock while morning light poured through the tall library windows. That isn't a press release. That's a staged piece of theater. And then there's the timing. Just 3 weeks before Princess Diana died in that Paris tunnel, she sat down at her writing desk inside Kensington Palace and drafted a letter to Princess Anne. A letter that no one, absolutely no one, knew existed until now. For 30 years, the world has been sold the same tired storyline, that these two women were bitter rivals who couldn't stand to be in the same room. The press cast Diana as the emotional fashion icon, and Anne as the no-nonsense workhorse who supposedly rolled her eyes at every headline. It turns out that entire framing was a lie. And the unsettling part is that the palace almost certainly knew it the whole time. Before we go deeper, if you're new to Royal Exposure, tap that subscribe button so you don't miss it when stories like this one crack open. Now let's get into what's actually written on that page, because the details are far more specific than vague emotional grievances. Diana wasn't simply venting about loneliness or isolation. 2 days before she picked up her pen, she had gotten her hands on an internal palace document. That document laid out a plan to slash her personal security detail as a pressure tactic, a way to force her to abandon her independent media work. She called it an administrative trap. That's her exact phrase, not a line invented by Charles Spencer, not the interpretation of some biographer. She wrote that the endgame was to invoke an obscure clause buried inside the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a custody battle over William and Harry, arguing that the sovereign held the authority to dictate where they lived, where they studied, and effectively every hour of their daily lives. That is not a paranoid woman spiraling into fear. That is a woman who watched the legal machinery being quietly assembled around her and made a calculated decision to put it on paper. When you match what she wrote against everything that unfolded in the years after her death, the letter takes on a much heavier weight. Diana specifically asked Anne to stand as an emotional shield between her boys and the traditionalists who wanted to mold them into cold symbols of the state. She described Anne as the only Windsor with the nerve to stare a reigning monarch in the face and defend a mother's most basic human rights. And here's what almost nobody is talking about yet. Anne actually did it. For 30 years, she fulfilled the request Diana made of her, and she never breathed a word about it in public. The court circulars from 1997 through 2005 reveal a quiet pattern. Anne repeatedly rearranged her charity engagements so that she would be at Windsor during the boys' school holidays. No cameras, no press pack, no royal correspondence logging her arrivals. She'd simply pull up in her private car, walk William and Harry through the grounds, and give them a quiet pocket of air away from the public relations firestorm raging over at Clarence House. That's not accidental. That's a woman keeping a promise she made to her sister-in-law. What separates this whole revelation from typical royal tabloid noise is the physical evidence behind it. Charles Spencer didn't just make a statement into a microphone. He spent 48 hours working alongside a forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives before he ever addressed the public. They studied the handwriting pressure patterns and matched them against hundreds of verified letters stored in the Spencer family repository. The signature checked out. The paper carried the Kensington Palace crest embossed at the top. The date scrawled in the corner reads August 10th, 1997. That's exactly 21 days before the crash in Paris. And a duplicate of the letter has been sitting inside a law firm's vault on Fleet Street, sealed inside a lead-lined container that was quietly registered under an anonymous corporate holding company 30 years ago. The palace legal team reportedly went hunting for any legal grounds to block publication and came up empty-handed. The letter was addressed to a private individual, not a state official, and it was recovered from the private archives of Althorp House. The Crown has zero constitutional footing to touch it. And that's where it starts to feel deeply strange. Because if the palace knew this letter existed, or even suspected it might, then the entire public narrative around Diana and Anne's relationship was a knowing fabrication. For years, the media painted a portrait of an icy, unbroken rivalry between them, claiming Anne viewed Diana as a shallow celebrity dragging the monarchy through the mud. But the administrative paper trail tells a completely different tale. Between 1996 and 1997, Anne's charity itinerary placed her in the same regional zones as Diana's private humanitarian visits on multiple occasions. Their vehicles were logged at identical service depots along the M4 motorway within 30 minutes of each other on 3 separate dates. Those weren't chance encounters in traffic. Those were private briefings, moments where Anne was slipping Diana tactical updates on the legal strategies being drawn up by the king's solicitors. And that timeline lines up with another detail now emerging into the light. During the summer of 1996, at a private family dinner inside Balmoral Castle, a senior advisor to the Queen floated the idea of invoking ancient crown property statutes to restrict Diana's access to her apartments at Kensington Palace. The plan was to push her office out of London entirely, weakening her ability to command media attention. Princess Anne cut the presentation off mid-sentence and dismantled it on the spot, branding the proposal an act of absolute corporate stupidity that would leave a permanent stain on the crown's reputation. The eviction plan was killed before it ever made it into an official warrant. Diana learned about the confrontation the very next morning through a secure phone line arranged by Anne's lady-in-waiting. So these two women weren't just polite in each other's company, they were running an active, coordinated resistance against the palace machinery. And honestly, the fact that Anne guarded this secret for 30 full years might be the most revealing part of the entire saga. Think about how many people have cashed in on Diana's story over the decades. Former staff members churning out tell-all books, friends sitting for tearful documentary interviews, secret tape recordings being auctioned off to international broadcasters for millions of pounds. Through every wave of public obsession, Anne gave 0 interviews. She authorized 0 press statements. She kept her copy of the letter locked inside a fireproof military-grade combination safe at Gatcombe Park, hidden beneath equestrian breeding logs and family land titles. When palace archivists requested a full audit of her private correspondence ahead of the King's Jubilee events, she shut the request down instantly. She informed them that her safe held personal family correspondence with no connection to the state's administrative workflow and refused to hand over the keys. The palace legal department apparently realized they had no way to force a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to surrender her private papers without triggering a scorched earth internal court battle. So the letter stayed sealed away, right up until Charles Spencer drove himself down to Gloucestershire in a private car to brief Anne on what he'd unearthed at Althorp. He told her his legal team had verified the original manuscript and that the public interest required its release to correct a historical lie. Anne listened in complete silence, leaning against her roll-top desk, and then gave her quiet blessing. She understood that with the Althorp copy already authenticated, any attempt to bury the duplicate would smell like a desperate palace cover-up. The safe was opened later that afternoon so her solicitors could cross-reference the text one last time. The duplicate matched down to the finest detail. Identical pressure points in the handwriting, the same faded black rollerball ink, the exact same Kensington Palace paper. And what's actually inside the letter contains details that are going to cause serious headaches for the current palace administration. Diana referenced a secret personal repository containing more than 200 original letters and diary entries stretching from her school days into her early marriage. She wrote that she had hidden this archive entirely outside the palace infrastructure, kept completely separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle. And here's the line that's probably keeping palace lawyers pacing their offices tonight. She instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever moved to completely block her access to her sons following the upcoming autumn term. Which means there may well be 200 more documents sitting in an anonymous vault somewhere, and their release is bound to a condition Diana put down in ink. The king's advisors are reportedly scrambling right now to trace the movement of old Spencer family holdings from that era, hoping to locate the repository before any further disclosures spill into the open. When you zoom out and look at the broader pattern, it exposes something fundamental about how the palace really operates. For decades, the public relations machinery worked methodically to frame the royal turmoil of the 1990s as a simple, tragic collapse of a private marriage. Millions of pounds from the sovereign grant were funneled into projecting an image of modern, streamlined continuity. The whole objective was to make the current reign appear stable and unified. But the surfacing of a hidden alliance between Diana and Anne completely shatters that corporate narrative. It proves that the deepest trust inside the court belonged to the traditional guard, not to the central hierarchy. And the woman the media painted as cold and distant was actually the one Diana leaned on most. The old administrative guard, sold to the public as the very embodiment of stability and order, was actively working to isolate and squeeze the mother of the future king. The palace communications department reportedly descended into complete chaos on Thursday morning when the news broke. More than 300 administrative computers inside the palace network simultaneously loaded the high-resolution scans uploaded from the Althorp press server. Senior media directors abandoned their morning tea and clustered around the monitoring wall, watching BBC News and Sky News run continuous live coverage. The front pages splashed enormous black typography across the page, dissecting the phrase administrative trap Diana had written 33 years earlier. The king's advisors began calculating the strategic damage the moment the coverage went wide. Public opinion polls showed more than 80% of citizens praising Anne for shouldering the emotional burden in silence, while public perception of the old administrative guard collapsed. The text painted the palace bureaucracy exactly as it appeared to be, a cold, controlling machine that placed institutional command above basic human compassion. The timing created an immediate operational nightmare for the communications team. They had been scheduled to launch a major media campaign on Friday morning promoting Queen Camilla's upcoming state charity appearances across London. Once the letter went viral, the media directors realized that rolling out fashion and lifestyle content would look tone-deaf on a scale that could never be recovered. While the public was absorbing a mother's final desperate warning, the king's chief secretary froze the entire promotional schedule and locked the media assets back inside the archive safe. Then came the phone call between Clarence House and Adelaide Cottage that really exposes where the balance of power now sits. The king's advisors wanted Prince William to sign off on a joint family statement acknowledging the letter's historical value while framing it as a relic of a bygone era of court friction. William rejected the script outright during a 20-minute call. He told his father's private secretary that he would not authorize his household to participate in any campaign designed to spin or dilute his mother's original words. He said the letter was an authentic piece of his family history, and he fully respected the absolute silence his Aunt Anne had maintained for 3 decades to shield his childhood. By refusing to back the defensive strategy, William effectively cut the king's advisors off at the knees and left the central palace apparatus wide open to the full weight of public scrutiny. The press office phones rang without pause, hundreds of international journalists demanding to know whether the Crown would launch a formal investigation into the secret repository referenced in the text. The press secretaries had nothing to give. All they could do was read a repetitive, sanitized statement about the private nature of historical family papers, their voices reportedly cracking under the pressure. The image of the palace that emerges from all of this is not one of dignified continuity. It's the image of a bureaucracy that spent decades curating a false story, only to have it shattered by a single sheet of pale blue paper locked inside a mahogany box under a country estate. Diana's postscript at the very bottom of the letter adds a haunting final layer. She wrote that she would be leaving for the Mediterranean the following morning, carrying a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that the time to secure her son's emotional safety was rapidly slipping away. That line, written 3 weeks before her death, transforms the document from ordinary family correspondence into something far heavier. It's a time-stamped record of a mother who could see the institutional forces closing in around her and chose to commit them to writing, trusting that one day the document would find its way into the light. And it did surface. Not through a leak, not through a tabloid payoff, but through her own brother slipping on white gloves in a library and turning a key in a lock that had been waiting for this exact moment. The administrative verification was officially stamped into the database at the London High Court Probate Registry on Friday afternoon. The original manuscript was placed inside a temperature-controlled archival box and permanently registered in the National History logs. That legal step means Diana's words now belong to the public record, sitting beyond the reach of palace censorship or quiet revision. The public reaction outside Buckingham Palace was striking to witness. Thousands of people stood in silence, clutching evening editions of newspapers featuring full-page reproductions of her sloping handwriting. Polls showed more than 90% of respondents expressing gratitude for Anne's protection of the young princes. The country didn't erupt in political fury so much as fall into a shared moment of reflection, as if millions of people were quietly recalibrating their understanding of what had truly unfolded behind those palace walls. What emerges from the letter, and from the 30 years of silence that trailed behind it, is a story about two women the world assumed were enemies, but who were in fact operating as allies against a system determined to control them both. Diana needed someone inside the institution who couldn't be bullied or shoved to the side. Anne was that person. She had spent her entire career pushing back against traditional expectations, refusing to let the press dictate her public image, brushing off image consultants, and running her office with a fierce independence that regularly irritated the central hierarchy. When Diana's marriage disintegrated, and her aristocratic friends quietly withdrew their invitations to avoid offending the future king, Anne was the only senior Windsor who refused to join the isolation campaign. She didn't deliver speeches about it. She didn't leak to the press. She simply kept turning up, kept passing along information, and kept her promise for 30 straight years. The modern court now finds itself in a reality where its long-term narrative management has been neutralized by a document it couldn't control and couldn't suppress. Prince William walks out of the fallout with his position strengthened because the public can now see clearly that his approach to leadership is directly aligned with the emotional blueprint his mother fought so hard to protect. The old guard of advisors has retreated into silence, cornered by the uncomfortable truth that within the history of the crown, an authentic maternal voice carries far more lasting power than the cold mechanics of institutional control. A mahogany box in a Northamptonshire library just accomplished what 30 years of palace public relations never could. It told the truth. And the truth is that when the system turned against Princess Diana, her most trusted protector turned out to be the hardest working royal of them all. And that's the detail that keeps circling back through my mind as I sit with this story. Anne never broke her word. Inside an institution where loyalty is constantly stress-tested against political convenience, where alliances shift with every swing in public sentiment, Anne stood absolutely immovable. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it for legacy. She did it because a mother asked her to protect her children, and she understood the gravity of that request in a way the palace machinery was simply incapable of grasping. The letter makes clear that Diana knew exactly what she was doing when she chose Anne. She wrote that Anne possessed a quality growing rarer inside the family, which she described as moral courage, unconnected to public approval ratings. That single phrase reframes everything anyone thought they understood about the internal dynamics of the Windsor family during its most turbulent modern chapter. There's something deeply moving about the physical details of how Anne preserved the secret. The fireproof safe at Gatcombe Park wasn't some sterile institutional storage locker. It was tucked away behind her personal study, surrounded by the ordinary clutter of her rural life. Equestrian ribbons hanging on the wall nearby, weather reports for upcoming horse trials pinned to a corkboard. The letter sat buried beneath decades of breeding logs, as though she had deliberately camouflaged it inside the most mundane corners of her daily routine, knowing that no one would ever think to hunt for a document of such explosive historical weight in a place like that. When the safe was finally opened for the cross-referencing, Anne's solicitors noted that the envelope was still sealed with the original wax stamp Diana had used. Anne had never even reopened it after the first reading. She had read it once, absorbed the mission, and locked it away, carrying the weight of its contents in her memory alone for 3 decades. The implications for the historical record are staggering. Every biography written about the royal family during the late 1990s will now need to be reassessed. Every documentary that framed Anne as cold or dismissive toward Diana will require a footnote conceding that the opposite was true. The entire framework historians have used to interpret the internal court dynamics of that era has been resting on a foundation of assumptions that this single letter has now knocked flat. Academic presses are already scrambling to commission revised analyses. Documentary producers who spent years compiling interviews with former palace staff are realizing that their sources either didn't know the truth or actively concealed it. The historical revision now approaching won't arrive as a gentle adjustment. It will land as a fundamental restructuring of how we understand power, loyalty, and resistance inside the modern monarchy. And then there's the question no one at the palace wants to answer publicly, but everyone is asking behind closed doors. Who else knew? If Anne was operating as Diana's inside source on legal strategies, she couldn't have pulled it off entirely alone. Someone in the Queen's private office must have suspected. Someone in the legal department must have noticed the pattern of canceled eviction proposals and quietly blocked administrative maneuvers. The fact that no one ever leaked this information, that no one ever sold the story to a tabloid for a fast fortune, suggests that Anne had cultivated a network of silent allies inside the institution. People who recognized that what was being done to Diana was wrong and who chose to quietly reinforce Anne's resistance rather than expose it. The full scope of that network may never be known, but its existence changes the way we ought to think about the palace as an institution. It wasn't a monolith of frigid bureaucratic control. It contained pockets of genuine human decency operating in the shadows. Charles Spencer's choice to release the letter now, after 30 years, raises its own set of questions. He has been the guardian of his sister's legacy since her death, and over the years he has taken criticism for being too protective, too combative, too unwilling to let the past settle. But the timing of this release carries the fingerprints of a careful, strategic calculation. The current monarchy is navigating a period of significant transition. The king's health concerns have accelerated the timeline for William's eventual succession. The public's relationship with the institution is under sharper scrutiny than it has been in decades. By releasing the letter at this precise moment, Spencer has ensured that Diana's voice re-enters the public conversation exactly when the institution is most vulnerable to historical accountability. He has handed William a powerful piece of his mother's legacy at the very moment he needs it most, and he has done it in a way the palace cannot control or spin. The letter also reshapes our understanding of Diana herself. For decades, she has been cast as a woman driven primarily by emotion, someone who reacted to circumstances rather than strategically shaping them. But this letter unveils a different Diana, a Diana who understood legal frameworks, who tracked administrative procedures, who built alliances with precision and intent. She wasn't simply writing an emotional plea to a family member. She was constructing a legal record, time-stamped and witnessed, designed to outlive her and safeguard her sons long after she was gone. The phrase administrative trap isn't the vocabulary of someone who is merely upset. It's the vocabulary of someone who has dissected the institutional mechanics closing in around her and is documenting them with clinical accuracy. This was a woman who, in the final weeks of her life, was fighting a sophisticated institutional war, using every tool available to her, and she chose Anne as her most trusted ally on that battlefield. The silence from certain corners of the palace has been deafening. While the communications department scrambles to contain the public fallout, several senior figures who were active during the 1990s have declined every request for comment. Their offices have issued statements about respecting the privacy of historical family matters, but the refusal to engage directly with the contents of the letter speaks louder than any prepared line. If the letter were inaccurate, if it were the product of misunderstanding or exaggeration, the palace would have moved quickly to correct the record. The fact that they haven't challenged its authenticity or its contents suggests they already know it's real, and they know that any attempt to dispute it would only invite deeper scrutiny of documents and records they'd much rather keep sealed. The public's response has been remarkable in its consistency. Across social media platforms, across newspaper comment sections, across radio call-in shows, the dominant emotion has been gratitude. Gratitude toward Anne for her silent decades of protection. Gratitude toward Charles Spencer for preserving and finally releasing his sister's words. Gratitude toward Diana for having the foresight to document what was happening while she still could. There's anger in the mix, of course, directed at the bureaucratic machinery that tried to isolate and control her. But the anger isn't the dominant note. The dominant note is something closer to vindication. For 30 years, millions of people who admired Diana had a nagging sense that the official narrative didn't quite capture the full truth of her experience. This letter validates that instinct. It confirms that what they suspected was real. Her sister-in-law truly was working alongside her, and the people she trusted most were the very ones the media told them she was at war with. As the days pass and the initial shock settles into deeper historical reassessment, the letter is likely to trigger a cascade of further revelations. Other documents will be re-examined. Other witnesses may finally step forward. The 200 additional letters and diary entries Diana referenced could eventually surface, adding new layers of depth and complexity to the historical record. But even if nothing else ever emerges, this single document has already accomplished something profound. It has restored the truth of a relationship the world misunderstood for 3 decades. It has revealed Anne as the quiet hero at the center of this story, a woman whose loyalty ran so deep that she carried a secret through 30 years of relentless public scrutiny without ever once reaching for credit. And it has given William and Harry a final message from their mother, a message that confirms what they have always known in their bones. She fought for them until the very last breath, and she chose her allies with wisdom and precision. The mahogany box stands empty now, its contents transferred into the National Archive. But the truth that once rested inside it will continue to reshape our understanding of the royal family for generations still to come.